You've all heard the narrative before. Hollywood used to produce really great cinema, but now it's all garbage. And there's a lot to complain about regarding modern video games, too. Now, there is an element of truth to be found in that narrative. But first, it's important to understand the historical context of such sentiments. You see, every generation has felt that way about art for thousands of years. Everything from movies to music to video games to literal fine art like paintings and sculptures. Movies nowadays are garbage, but they used to be great. Music today is garbage, but back when I was growing up, it was great. Video games now are garbage, but when I was a kid, they were great. Modern art is garbage, but the art of the Renaissance was great. So, is it really just that people are becoming bad at creating art now? What happened? Now that there's more people than ever before, somehow nobody out of the billions of us knows how to create good art? No, that doesn't seem likely, does it? So what's going on? Well, two things are going on. One, bad art is being produced, yes. And two, we have a faulty perception of how much bad art is being produced. First, let's address the phenomenon of bad art. Now, some people will blame bad art on politics. They'll blame it on wokeism or postmodernism or some other culture war boogeyman infecting everything, usually via some grand conspiracy. That's just opportunistic propaganda. The truth is much simpler and much closer to the opposite. Yes, politics is involved, but it's actually politics that has much more to do with consumerism than wokeism or postmodernism. It's more accurate to say that the art we're accustomed to is becoming far more expensive to create and more susceptible to corruption via greedy practices. So only those with a lot of money get to decide what gets created, and at the very least, what gets seen or experienced and how. Few make the decisions and control the platforms. A big blockbuster movie or a AAA video game is going to take tons of money to create because of all the people involved, the set pieces, the effects, the promotion, etc. It's less about sinister conspiracies and more about incentive structures. And pretty soon, you might not even be able to own art, as in modern media, at all. Only subscribe to it, as subscription-based models are more profitable and bring in a reliable source of long-term revenue. It seems that we are currently undergoing that transition. And perhaps the idea of owning a movie or a video game will be very alien to our grandchildren. And I admit I do not like the sound of that, because if you cannot possess it, then your access to it can end, or the artwork itself can be changed in a way you dislike, and there will be no recourse for you. It's one of the reasons I don't play MMOs. It's also the reason that if I really like a movie or a show, I try to get it on disc, rather than relying on some service provider to keep providing it, because sometimes they don't. It's also the reason I dislike online requirements for gaming, even single-player games. But now, even discs are going away. Your ownership eats into the bottom line of a subscription model, so your ownership will most likely go away. Your existence as an owner will shift to that of a subscriber and a consumer of content. When you don't have much money, you work for your money. But when you have a lot of money, it reverses, and your money works for you. Our system is not exactly a meritocracy, as many would like you to believe. It can have elements of a meritocracy, sure, but our society does not primarily reward talent, skill, knowledge, or hard work. It can, yes, but not primarily. If it did, then we would live in a much different world. It's what we're brought up to believe, But the truth is less fair. What it does reward far more consistently is wealth. The more wealth you have, the more you can invest and leverage, and the more you are rewarded with even more wealth and more influence. Interest compounds. But most investments carry with them an element of risk. When people invest in art, they are still concerned with what every other investor is concerned with: risk aversion. They want their money to make money, not lose money. The key is maximum reward for minimum risk. So, are you going to risk $200 million on a genre defying script written by some new author with a singular coherent vision? No, that's too risky and untested. They don't have an audience, nobody knows them or their intellectual property, but are you going to risk $200 million on a Star Wars movie? Well, yeah, that's far more likely to pay off. And because the investment is what's actually driving the art rather than passion or vision like the original Star Wars movie, and even that was derivative, you're not going to want to put all your eggs in one basket by turning to any one person to write a script, but rather an entire committee of people. And they will do so not because they were inspired to create a specific story that they genuinely care about, but because they're being paid. They can all offer various inputs and create a mishmash of a story that could potentially have the broadest possible appeal. Nobody will want to put $200 million on the back of a single person. Will it be as successful as a singular coherent vision has the potential to be? Well, most likely no. But it also won't be as unsuccessful as a singular coherent vision has the potential to be either. See, the name of the game is not to produce a great timeless work of art, but to create something that could pump out a good percentage with the least possible risk. Now, from the investment perspective, who cares if it's actually good or not? Shitty movies make hundreds of millions of dollars while great movies flop all the time. The investor is not concerned with the final product nearly as much as the final profit. And that's what repeats throughout the entertainment industry, including video games. The result is homogenization. Everything becomes the same. Everything turns into sequels, remakes, reboots, and remasters of things that were already successful, already tried and tested. Don't want to take risks on anything new, but if you do, you better be able to compare it to something that is already known so that you can explain what it's like, which genre it is, which niche it fills, who the audience is supposed to be, which box you can be put into. When pitching an idea, you better be able to do it in a sentence or two, which demands pre-existing familiarity. If your proposal demands explaining new concepts, you've already lost. Now, don't get me wrong, art has always been a process of reiteration. Even something as old as the Bible says there's nothing new under the sun. But what we're seeing now is far more explicit and direct. It's less inspiration and more direct copying. I remember people throughout my life telling me that the result of communism is that everything ends up being the same, homogeneous and boring. But as it turns out, when you drive all the wealth and power into the hands of the few and base all incentive structures on the accumulation of wealth and power, the result is quite similar. Everything ends up being the same, homogeneous, boring. All the little fish get eaten by the medium-sized fish, and all the medium-sized fish get eaten by the big fish, and at the end of the day, all you have left is a few really big fish, and then everything you get must first be approved by the big fish. So we know that a lot of bad art is being produced, and by bad I mean unoriginal, unchallenging, homogenized content slop to feed the masses. But is more bad art being produced now than there used to be? Yes, but not for the reasons I've already mentioned. It's just that more art is being produced now than ever before, and this includes both bad and good art. But per capita, I would not say that more bad art is being produced now than decades ago. There's a reason we believe that the quality of art is in decline, and it has nothing to do with the age old excuse of societal degeneracy and immorality. Nostalgia can definitely play a huge part of it, but what's really happening with our inaccurate perception of declining art quality is a form of survivorship bias. It's why people of every generation feel that art used to be better than it is in the present, whatever present they were in, be it 10 years ago or 100 years ago. What do I mean by survivorship bias? Well, it's a logical error in which you concentrate on the successes of a group while ignoring the failures, which gives you a false impression. The most famous example was in determining how to reinforce bombers in World War II. If a bomber made it back, then intuition told people to reinforce the areas of the bomber that received a lot of damage. But that's not very logical. If the bomber survived, then it proved that the areas that were damaged did not need to be reinforced because it could survive even if those areas were damaged. The ones that did not survive likely received damage in the other areas. So those areas, the undamaged areas, are the areas that should be reinforced. That way, more planes could make it back. Logical, but not intuitive. In art, we have a similar kind of bias. Good art stands the test of time, while bad art is typically forgotten and swept into the dustbin of history. The result is that people compare the worst of the present to the best of the past. So, if you think about movies that were made in a particular decade of the past, you're only going to remember the good ones. But if you focus on only the bad movies and video games of the old days, you will actually have an endless library of garbage to sift through, more than you could ever experience throughout your lifetime. For example, of the 1970s, you remember things like Star Wars, The Godfather, Jaws, Apocalypse Now, and a bunch of other great movies, sure. But do you remember other movies of the 70s like Skate Town, USA, Craze, Vampire Hookers, Moon of the Wolf, Orca, etc.? Here's a list of video games that were made in the 1980s. How many of them do you recognize as great games? How many of these games would you have disliked? Probably most of them. I had access to a bunch of these games in the 80s, but only consistently played around a couple dozen of them. What you will find if you study the art of any decade is that far more bad art is produced than great art. After all, isn't that the very nature of greatness? It's unique, rare, exceptional. What's great is what gets passed on. Star Wars, The Godfather, Jaws, and Apocalypse Now are all movies that I currently own in the year 2024, 50 years after they were made. What I do not own, and what I will bet that you don't own either, is Vampire Hookers. But you know who was very well aware of all the bad art of the 1970s? The people of the 1970s while they lived through it, but not anymore. They forgot about it all. And now they only remember the greats, the great stuff from back in my day, which was so much better, you see. And what if back in the 1970s, social media existed with culture war critics beating the drum that Vampire Hookers is an obvious sign that we are in decline from the great days of the 1940s, which brought us Gone with the Wind, Casablanca, and The Wizard of Oz? What about this decade, the 2020s? Well, COVID put us a bit behind in terms of production, but to Here, modern day social media culture war critics, you would think that absolutely nothing good is being produced now, and that the golden era of high art is behind us because everything is ESG, DEI, PC, or whatever thought terminating acronym you want to use to just become another version of the grumpy old man shouting at kids to get off your lawn. The incentive structure of social media promotes that type of content because it's divisive and negative, which ends up reinforcing the narrative that concentrates primarily on the bad art of today and compares it primarily to the good art of the past. This plays into our natural tendency to be aware of all the bad art that is currently being made, which will be forgotten by the time the next decades roll around and we look back at the 2020s as the golden era of high art, because we forgot about all the bad stuff. In the 2030s and beyond, in terms of sheer popularity, people will remember this decade as the decade that gave us blockbusters like Oppenheimer, Barbie, Tenet, and continuations of Dune, John Wick, Top Gun, James Bond, Avatar, Inside Out, and Mission Impossible, not to mention whatever the second half of this decade has yet to produce. Yes, good art is being produced, but notice that what actually has the funding to support popularity is almost all derivative. So both issues are happening simultaneously. Great art is being produced, but not necessarily seen, along with a lot of the bad art that will be mocked and forgotten. Take a look at the highest grossing films of every year this decade so far. In 2021, 8 of the top 10 grossing films were derivative. In 2022, every single one of the top 10 grossing films were derivative. In 2023, 7 and arguably 8 of the top 10 grossing films were derivative. And in 2024, 9 of the top 10 grossing films so far were derivative. Why? Risk aversion. The motive is money, not art. If it's new, if it hasn't been tried and tested, then it's more risky. What about video games? Well, the 2020s gave us Elden Ring, Cyberpunk 2077, Ghost of Tsushima, and continuations like Baldur's Gate 3, God of War Ragnarok, Doom Eternal, Final Fantasy XVI, and Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. In 2021, the top 10 grossing games were all derivative. In 2022, 9 of the top 10 games were derivative. In 2023, the top 10 grossing games were all derivative. And in 2024, the top 10 grossing games were also all derivative. So the news is both good and bad. The truth is that you live within an embarrassment of riches, so much so that you don't have enough time in your life to enjoy all the great art that is being produced now. But to find it, you have to sift through an endless ocean of either bad or derivative art. There are very many good movies and games that have been produced recently that you probably haven't heard of because they did not become very popular, because popular doesn't necessarily mean good or bad. But the people who do see them and play them will remember them and will remember that they came from the 2020s. And some of those more popular games and movies are indeed quite good, and they will be remembered by far more people. But notice how many of those are sequels, remakes, reboots, or remasters. That is the effect of our financial incentive structure, combined with the extreme wealth inequality of our society. They can be good, sure, but they're also going to be homogeneous. And by the time you die, there will be 1,000 different versions of Spider-Man, which for me is like a form of hell. That result is not because of any one particular generation or because human beings suddenly lost their ability to be creative or because of some boogeyman concern like wokeness or postmodernism. Here's what it really is. It's just the end result of the incentive structure enthusiastically supported by the very people who complain the most about its result. Consumerism. That's it. And incidentally, that's also why the problem will persist. If you keep changing your car's windshield washer fluid because you think it'll fix the transmission and nobody can convince you otherwise, and all the people you listen to are being paid to tell you that it's the windshield washer fluid, well, then your car's transmission will never be fixed. What's sad to me is that there are millions of great stories out there that will remain undiscovered or untold simply because none of the people with power will take a chance on them. And what gets seen now is largely determined by what people with power enable you to see. And the people with power did not necessarily gain their power through any sort of actual meritocracy. Our world rewards greed, and that is what has a real effect on art. It's not the wokes, it's not the postmodernists, it's greed. That's the world you live in. A world shaped by self-interested, powerful people, unqualified to shape it. The rest of your life will be a series of attempts to either mitigate or grow accustomed to the deleterious effects they inflict upon you.